Hi, my name is John Worley. I'm the Technical Services Manager with ARIN, and what I want to share with you is a presentation that I give at ARIN on the Road events. It's called Life After IPv4 Depletion. ARIN on the Road events are where ARIN staff goes out into the community, particularly to areas we don't typically hit with our twice annual public policy and members meetings, and talk about things that are of interest to network operators, both internet service providers and end users. This particular presentation focuses on IPv4 depletion. And this is something we've known was going to happen for decades. In the early to mid 1990s, we had classful addressing. That was where Class A was about 17 million addresses, Class B was about 65,000, and the Class C was 256. When we were doing that, there was a fear we'd quickly run out of addresses. Because we were only giving out 3 sizes of block, oftentimes when somebody needed a middle amount, they would get a block that was way too large. So this has been on the horizon for a while. Now, we did alleviate that. CIDR, which is classless interdomain routing, was developed so that we could issue a range of block sizes, not just 3 different ones. So that kind of put off the horizon for running out of V4 addresses, but it's kind of something we've always known was on the horizon. And that horizon became reality on the 24th of September 2015 in the ARIN region. That was the point at which we ran out of V4 addresses in our general use pool and had no more to give out. Now, what I want to talk about in this presentation today is what your options are. A couple of them we'll talk about. One of them is there's a waiting list people can go on in case space becomes available. There's also a transfer market, which essentially involves people releasing addresses to other people that need them, and there might be some monetary exchange involved with that. It's also something that's a specified transfer listing service, which is there to help people who need addresses find people who have them available. So, this is a mapping out of how many V4 requests we've gotten each month since we hit depletion. And you'll note on the left side of the screen, you'll note this starts at July 2015. That was actually when our waiting list was first used. And we'll talk about the waiting list a little bit later. The red dashed line is where we hit actual depletion. That's where we said, we have no more V4, be advised, community, nothing's left. You can see, of course, it makes sense, just at the waiting list time was really a peak volume of requests. That was everybody trying to come in and get the very last bits we had available. So you can see there's about 400. The peak we've ever seen is probably about 450. So you can see that was the volume of requests we're getting. You can see it's kind of slowed down over time, which is obviously what you'd expect, until it reached sort of a steady state point of plus or minus a request per month. Now this is sort of interesting. You might think, well, we just talked about there's no more V4 addresses left. Why are people putting in requests? The answer to that is interesting, and several aspects to that. So there's a waiting list. You have to qualify under current ARIN policy to get on this waiting list. There's a maximum approved size, which basically policies say we can approve you for so much, for example, 3 months currently. And you can also specify you'll accept something smaller. Now, it's important to note you will only ever get 1 block when you go on the waiting list. So, consider that carefully. The smaller your minimum acceptable size, the bigger chance you'll get a block, but the chance also increases you'll get something less than the total you were approved for. And you can only have 1 request per organization on the list at a time, essentially to prevent large networks from putting in a bunch of requests and getting all the rest of the space. We published the waiting list on our website. This was something that wasn't originally anticipated, but because it was very important for us to be transparent, we now publish an anonymized version. So all the organization information is redacted, but we publish what number they are, what block size they're approved for, and what the minimum sizes they'll accept. This is basically to allow the community to see what we're doing and make sure, for example, there's no malfeasance going on where some analyst, pushes somebody up the waiting list or gives a block out to somebody they shouldn't have. The community can always see what's happening, and that enables them to see what we're doing, making sure everything's above board. Now, if there's a waiting list, you might ask, of course, is there going to be anything available? That's very relevant. If you're waiting a month, you're waiting 2 months, you're waiting a year, 2 years, that's very important for you to know. So in talking about how long it's going to be, we have to really talk about where we get those blocks back from. And there are basically 3 sources. The first is IANA redistribution, which is twice a year. All the regional internet registries have policies which allow them to push space back up to IANA that they receive. That's entirely optional, but if they do that, then IANA just divides it into 5 equal-sized chunks twice a year and gives it to the RIRs. This has been more of something in the past than it will be going forward. In the past, we've gotten some distributions that have been fairly large, like a /14 equivalent. Over time, it's gotten increasingly small, and unless somebody in the world returns a fair amount of space to the IANA, it's probably going to keep decreasing in size. So, in other words, it's very possible just only one request will be satisfied with any distribution. I have no way of knowing, but that's at this point decreasing in size every 6 months. We also have return v4 blocks, and that's where people just say, ARIN, I'm not using this, please take it back. I talked about there's a transfer market, so you might think, why are people returning it? It's basically out of the goodness of their heart. They're just some people who want to do the right thing. There's also revoked v4 blocks. This is basically when somebody doesn't pay their bills. It could, in other circumstances, be they submitted a fraudulent request or something like that, but generally it's somebody didn't pay their bills, and after a certain amount of time, the contract we have says becomes revoked, you have no right to it anymore, and somebody else gets it. Now, the important thing to note here is that there is a very lengthy review process before any returned or revoked blocks get reissued. And that's basically out of an abundance of caution. If someone returns something and they weren't authorized, let's say, for example, it's some low-level NOC employee, and then, let's say the CEO finds out and says, that guy wasn't authorized, it's a problem for us, because if we return it and give it to somebody else, and somebody makes a legitimate claim that says, you should have never been able to take that back, we have a very big problem. We don't have any more v4 to give them to fill the request. Similarly, with revoked stuff, we have to make sure that we did everything that's required in the contract. So, did we send all the required notices? Did we send a final notice in the way we're required to? Did we make sure we didn't get payment? So all of this is done with a number of management team members. Anywhere between 2 and 4 management team members have to sign off on all of these. What that means is it's a lengthy process. We do try to get stuff out as quickly as we can, but it's more important for us to make absolutely sure that there's no legitimate claim to any v4 block before we reissue it. What does the waiting list look like over time in terms of growth? This is also kind of what you'd expect. Again, we're starting at when the waiting list was implemented in June 2015. Actually, it was July 2015. June was the first time there was nothing on the waiting list. And you can see, again, the red line is the v4 depletion, which is in the middle of September 2015. And it's kind of what you'd expect. We have a steadily increasing upward number till we get to a little under 400, at which point it starts to level off. And you can see in the past few months, we've actually been able to significantly decrease the number of waiting list requests. And that's because we've been able to fill a lot of requests. So, in terms of statistics, this is what people really want to know. I'm going to go on it. What has happened so I can get some idea of what my chances are. At the time of this slide deck, we had gotten 563 requests to be added to the waiting list. 104 of those, which is 18%, have been filled. Now, they typically wait about 14 months. That's how long the last request we filled. That's how long they waited. 114 of them dropped off. This is mostly because they got v4 via the transfer market. And 345, which is 61%, are still waiting. The oldest one of those was added July 23rd, 2015. So we're going almost a year and a half at this point that people have been waiting. So, requests do get filled, but the wait is essentially indefinite. That time frame could decrease, could increase, no way of knowing, but this at least gives you some idea of what's happened in the past. So, we also have some space that's reserved, and essentially what this was is the community of network operators in the ARIN region said, we know depletion is going to happen, let's make sure to set aside some space for important things, so that after we hit depletion, certain things we consider very important will still be able to get addresses. And one of those is a critical infrastructure reserve. This policy basically reserved 2/16s, that's 512/24s, only for public exchange points, ICANN-sanctioned core DNS operators, the regional internet registries, and IANA. New GTL deals are not eligible, so that's .whatever. Anything that, when IANA opened up GTLD registration to essentially anybody that wanted to apply, those are not eligible per the policy. And only 12.1% of that is used. So there's a fair amount left. Now keep in mind, it's only these specific organizations. So we do get people saying, I'm critical, I manage a financial exchange, or I manage an emergency response network. And while we're not denying those could be considered critical, this policy specifically defines only these as being eligible to get the space. We also have a reserved IPv4 block that's intended to help facilitate IPv6 deployment. Now, we have a separate presentation we will be adding to the site, which is about v6 deployment. Please stay tuned for that. We will talk about that. It's something that is very important, especially for people that don't already have v4 from ARIN. So please make sure to tune back in for that. Our transfer policies, there are 3 of them. And this is basically the transfer market. This is for basically folks who don't want to go on the waiting list, can't wait on the waiting list, or maybe need something that's larger than typically available on the waiting list. So a transfer policy that has always existed is a merger and acquisition transfer policy. And this is basically where we issued a block, and somebody bought the network, bought the company, and now they're just changed the name on the front of the building. So it's still the same network, still operating, and they just need to change who it's registered to. So for a long time, that was the only type of transfer policy. The community ethic was essentially, if you buy a network and they're using space, you can inherit it, you can transfer it. Otherwise, if you don't need it anymore, you must return it. That changed in 2009 when we had the first transfer as a specified recipient policy. Essentially, this was the community realizing that we knew depletion was going to happen, and if there wasn't a policy that allowed people to transfer unused addresses, essentially what we'd have is something of a black market where none of the transfers became recorded. So people would, obviously, the people who need v4 addresses are going to get them somehow, and if we didn't have a policy, essentially that would all happen. WHOIS would never get updated. There would be no central registration authority for everything. So realizing that, the community passed a policy which essentially says if you've got unused v4 addresses, they don't have to be unused, but usually they are, you can release them to somebody who needs them. And obviously it's become particularly useful after v4 depletion as a source of available IPv4 addresses. Now, practically speaking, this is something that involves typically some sort of monetary compensation going back and forth. It's not something that ARIN has anything to do with. We're basically the DMV. We don't have anything to do with the financial transaction. All we do is record, essentially, the registration transferring from one party to another. And shortly after that, about 3 years after the first specified transfer recipient policy was implemented, we introduced an inter-RIR transfer policy. So there's 4 other regional internet registries around the world. This allows other RIRs, if they meet certain requirements, to transfer back and forth. In other words, if you want to release something to somebody in Europe or the Asia-Pacific region, that's what allows you to do it, and vice versa, to get something from somebody in those regions. So looking at the specified transfer recipient policy, as I mentioned, this is basically a way for people with unused v4 addresses to transfer them to people who need them. The important thing here is that there must be no disputes on the source side as to who the registrant is. This is incredibly important because it's when we approve one of these, it's basically a one-way type deal. So we spend a whole lot of time making sure that there's no dispute, that there hasn't been a transaction, for example, a company got spun off that might have a legitimate claim, or somebody has acquired the company. So we're spending a whole lot of time verifying that because we really don't ever want to approve anything that there's any chance where somebody might come back and say, actually, that was my block. You shouldn't have let that person transfer it. And for the recipient, basically, they're demonstrating a 24-month need for the addresses. This is not an incredibly difficult bar to meet. It's 24 months. We're using a lot of projections and future growth is being taken into account. So it's basically making sure there's some real-world basis for your projections and not just number out of a hat. So it's not quite as rigorous if you're familiar with how we did 3-month reviews or reviews in general prior to depletion. It's not that intensive. It's just to make sure there's some realistic basis for what you're saying you need. Looking at specified transfer recipient growth, this is the number of specified transfers month over month, starting at when the waiting list was implemented. And as with all the other ones, on the very left, that's July 2015. When we started the waiting list, the red dashed line is when v4 depletion occurred in September 2015. You can see it's increased steadily over time. And this is something we expect to continue. As we noted earlier, the waiting list, people are waiting, about 14 months to get space. Only 18% of the people who've gone on it have gotten a block. So you can expect, and I'll talk about this later, that v4 consumption really has continued. People just didn't stop using v4 after we hit depletion. They just have started getting it in other ways. So we expect this line to continue going up and to the right for the foreseeable future. Inter-RIR transfers, it's basically the same as a specified transfer, except one side, either the one source or the one that's recipient, is in another region. So the main difference here is that the other RIR must have what's defined as reciprocal compatible needs-based policies. What that basically means is reciprocal means it has to go both ways. A policy has to both allow us to transfer to that RIR as well as transfer back. Compatible just basically means it has to work together, and needs-based means there must be some aspect of need evaluation. In other words, the policy can't just say anybody can get whatever they want. There has to be some need evaluation. It doesn't say what that is. It doesn't say it has to be 2 years, 5 years, anything like that. It really just says there has to be some sort of need evaluation in the policy. And right now, the two RIRs that meet that are APNIC, which serves the Asia-Pacific region, and RIPE NCC, which serves primarily Europe. And those are the ones right now you can do transfers with. Otherwise, it's fairly similar other than dealing with another RIR as to specified recipient transfers. Looking at inter-RIR transfers, this is the same timeline as you've seen in the other slides. You can see here, what's interesting is this has been much more sporadic than specified recipient transfers. You can see, in fact, January 6, 2016, we had none of them. So early on, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some months we'd get 10, some months 0. You can see it's now started to climb to the point where we expect to regularly get a fair volume, 10 plus inter-RIR transfers, particularly now that we have RIPE in addition to APNIC as participating RIRs. I would expect this number. Now note, it's much less. It's maybe like a tenth of the volume of specified recipient transfers, but it will still continue to grow, is the expectation. So this is a slide. I mentioned earlier that V4 consumption hasn't decreased. This is a slide that was developed for this presentation to really show whether or not that was the case. Because we really didn't know, when we developed this slide, right before we did it, we really didn't know, did people stop using V4 or stop using it at the same rate as they did before depletion? And what this shows is, if you look at the blue here is what we issued from the free pool. So essentially pre-depletion that you can see before September 2015, you could see it was growing fairly rapidly, right? We still had a free pool available. And you can see after September 2015, it starts to level off because we have very little left. The pink is the transfer market. This is everything that's going into ARIN, either via specified recipient transfer or inter-RIR transfer to us. And you can see basically if you draw a line from the rate at which people were using V4 early on the left side, if you draw it upwards, you'll see it basically meets where it would have been anyway. In other words, the transfer market has essentially completely picked up the slack, and there's no change in the overall consumption rate. We're just seeing it's coming from a different place. So something that's interesting, we didn't really know what was going to happen, and looking back now that we're almost this point, a year and a half after depletion, interesting to see that's not dropped off. So will that continue? It's difficult to say. For the near future, probably so. Will we ever see the rate decrease? Very possible. It's just hard to forecast the future. Another thing I want to touch on in this presentation, ARIN, prior to V4 depletion, there was quite a debate about what type of staffing levels we'd need in order to meet our responsibilities as the numbers registry for our region. There was a faction of people saying, look, V4 is going to run out. People only need to come in and request IPv6 once because the blocks are so big. Most of what we're going to need is just a few people to do V6, a few people to do AS number requests, and you're going to need a lot less people. So there was a concern there. There's also a concern that we might need more people, that a foreseen transfer market might require a whole lot more work. So it's very important for us before depletion to train analysts, to ramp them up. It takes really at least 6 months. So we really needed to make sure we were appropriately staffed and to have guessed right. In other words, as to how many people we needed. If we had decreased in staff, expecting a lower volume, and we were hit with a much higher volume, well, all of a sudden you're talking about people waiting weeks to get a response to their ticket, which is just not acceptable. This graph is designed to show you all the V4 requests we get, both the regular ones from the free pool, which are in blue here, and the need-based transfer ones, which are in pink here. And you can see before depletion hit, on the very left, we were getting about between 400 and 450 total V4 requests per month. You can see, as you move over to the right, you can see the transfer market is in large part picked up that slack. So we're still getting somewhere about 300, sometimes up to 350 requests for V4 per month. They're just different types. They're more transfer market requests. And these often are actually more time consuming, particularly because with V4 free pool requests, pre-depletion, for example, we're dealing with people who had dealt with us a lot. They knew what they were doing. There often wasn't a whole lot to review. Basically, we're giving out a free pool. As long as you qualify, there you go. With the transfer market, there's a significant workload in verifying that the source is authorized to release it. basically chain of custody research to make sure, okay, yes, this person's authorized to release it, not somebody else. That takes a whole lot of work, so it's debatable we might be doing more work for v4 than we did before we ran out, which is quite interesting. Unfortunately, our staffing levels remained appropriate so that we were, with the small exception of right around depletion, able to meet our service level agreements, which is good for everybody. So, for the transfer market, if you're interested in getting space, this is something that's highly recommended. It's a free service that confirms your 24-month projected need for IPv4 addresses. Essentially, it allows you to bid with confidence, right? We will enter in a 24-month pre-approval. It goes into our systems, and then you can get addresses over the transfer market whenever you need them via multiple specified recipient transfers or theoretically inter-IR transfers up to that pre-approved amount over the next 24 months without needing to re-justify every time. So in other words, you get a pre-approved for, let's say, /20. You find a good deal on a /24 or /23, you can keep getting those and accumulate them until you get your total pre-approved amount. There is a fee of $300 to complete each individual transfer, but you don't need to re-justify, is the good news. And if you do get all your pre-approved amount before 24 months, no problem. You just apply for a new pre-approval and we approve you for whatever your then, at the time, 24-month need is. So this is highly recommended for anybody who's interested in going on the transfer market seeking address space. We also offer something called the Specified Transfer Listing Service. And essentially, this was designed in order to match up people who had addresses with people who needed them, and specifically people that have validated blocks available and validated need. So this is optional. It is fee-based. There's a $100 nominal fee to participate, and essentially we verify if you're sourced, you hold the title of the registration, you're authorized to release it. For a recipient, essentially it's a pre-approval that's visible. And once you get into STLS, you can see a spreadsheet of all the participants along with their contact info, and you can know, for example, if somebody lists a block as available, ARIN is approved, yes, they're authorized to release it. There's also an option for facilitators to participate. And we list these. Facilitators are essentially IPv4 brokers. They're sort of niche businesses that specialize in matching up organizations that need address space with people that have them. We do offer a public listing of those. Now, that is on our website. It's really just anybody who's paid $100 to be listed as a facilitator. It doesn't convey they facilitate or they are any good at it. However, it may be a useful starting point if you're looking for somebody to match up with. You can also use STLS or really any way you want to. You want to Google buy IPv4 addresses, you can do that. We're essentially agnostic as to how you do it. This is just offered as one option you have. And we do have a public summary on our website of how many blocks there are and how many people are approved and what sizes. Basically to let you gauge, is this something I'm interested in before you go ahead and participate. So, takeaways from this presentation. v4 consumption is still strong. So, we've hit depletion, but people still want v4. The waiting list is proof positive of that. The transfer market is really picking up entirely the slack that was lost when we ran out of v4. So, for the foreseeable future, v4 will continue to be consumed, and we would think about the same rate it has been historically. If you need v4, get pre-approved. It's free. Really, everyone should do that. There's really no downside. It's very easy. And you might want to look at the transfer market, at least to know what your options are. What are the current prices people seem to be charging? It's nothing we know, but you can probably find that if you contact a broker or do any research. I also mentioned there's a v6 reserved block of v4 for IPv6 deployment. That is something that's highly recommended. Again, it will come in a future presentation. Please stay tuned for that. The waitlist is an option if you can defer your need. But you do need to be able to just say, I can wait an indefinite period of time. It might be that things speed up and people are getting blocks in 6 months. It could be that it slows down and people are waiting 18 months. There's just no way to know. So you should be prepared to wait indefinitely. Also, if you get a transfer, you are removed from the waiting list. So if you anticipate going in the transfer market, you could go on the waiting list, but you will be removed as soon as you get space via transfer. The final takeaway is that v6 is still the future. Remember that we are on a world with billions of people, each of whom has multiple devices. And it's not realistic. v4 simply isn't large enough for that world. There just aren't enough addresses. So, this presentation gives you some idea of where you can continue to get v4 addresses. But remember, v6 is still the only protocol that really scales to the future of the internet, indeed the current internet, really. We will be putting out a second presentation about v6, so please stay tuned for that. This presentation is designed for participation in a room. So this is where we ask anybody who has questions or to participate. If you have any questions, please tweet us at Team ARIN. We'll be happy to respond back. And please stay tuned to Team ARIN We do post where we're going for on-the-road events, so if you'd like to receive this type of information in the future, we highly encourage you. If there's an ARIN event in your area, we'd love to see you out there. We'd love to participate and see our community. So thank you very much for watching this.